Hello, my name is Mehmet, and I'm a PhD candidate in the History Department at University of California, Davis, and this is my 5th year in the program. Prior to UC Davis, I received my bachelor's and master's degrees in sociology at Middle East Technical University, Ankara, Turkey. After completing my master's, I started to the PhD program of the History Department at UC Davis in 2017. My dissertation project is tentatively titled as the 17th century social transformation and emergence of a new rural gentry in the Ottoman Empire. On the basis of my ongoing research on one Anatolian province, namely Kütahya, and one Balkan province, Salonika, I came to a preliminary conclusion that in the 17th century, there emerged a landed gentry who made their fortunes through expropriating formerly state-owned peasant lands. These lands were known as çiftliks in Turkish, or large military farms or estates. In parallel to the formation process of this landed gentry, a certain number of peasants were reduced to be the tenants and sharecroppers of these landowners. Some even became the agricultural workers in these privately owned farms. In contrast to the 16th century peasant subsistence economy, these privately owned large estates engaged in commercial agriculture to a certain extent. Although the distribution and size of these privately owned farms vary geographically, they played an important role in the making of a new social groups within the context of the general social and economic transformation in the 17th century. In my research, I'm using extensive archival material from the Ottoman archives, including tax surveys of the 16th and 17th centuries called tahrir defterleri in Turkish, local court registers, registers of important affairs, registers of complaints, registers concerning the Tımar system and tax farming, and relevant chronicles, fatwa collections, and travel accounts. Before the 17th century, the classical agrarian order of the Ottoman Empire was based upon the state-owned land regime, which is called Miri, independent peasantry, and state military administrative apparatus, otherwise known as the Tımar system. During that time, the primary class division was between the ruling and tax-collecting military elite, which is called askeri, and the tax-paying subjects, namely the reaya. In this order, the production was made by the subjects, while the military elite had the claim over the surplus in the form of revenue. Reaya was constituted by 3 main groups: urban dwellers, nomads, and mostly peasants. These peasants were mainly living and working on the state-owned lands with their usufruct rights. In theory, peasants were bounded to the land, but they could find or buy their way out. To maintain this structure, the Ottoman state conducted regular tax surveys to inspect the situation of the country. In short, if you follow the conventional term formulated by Professor Halil İnalcık, during the classical age of the Ottoman Empire, from 14th to the late 16th century, the Ottoman state owned the main bulk of the revenue-producing land on which peasants were living with their usufruct rights. And the military elite had the right to collect revenue from peasantry in return of their military service to the central government. However, this structure started to change during the late 16th century. In the literature, the 17th century is generally considered as an age of crisis and transformation, even though the dynamics of this crisis is debated. This crisis was a complex amalgamation of a demographic and economic conditions encompassing the daily life in the countryside and fiscal, political, and oppressive crisis of the Ottoman state. More specifically, in Anatolia, the 16th century population pressure met with the state's financial and political crisis. Subsequently, vagrant masses, intra-elite struggles, and the structural, economic, and demographic problems all constituted the reign of generalized violence in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Celali rebellions and the great flight of peasants were 2 important outcomes of this turmoil. As a result, the Anatolian rural order completely collapsed in the first half of the 17th century. The situation was slightly different in the Balkans. Actually, we don't know whether there was a similar demographic, social, and economic dynamics in the Balkan provinces, because there is no conclusive study about this question yet. This is also one of the major questions of my dissertation to answer. Moreover, there is also no scholarly consensus on those çiftliks, the military estates, the phenomenon which is the point of departure of my study. Although the question of these military farms has already been raised by some scholars, the literature on this question is limited, and it is very difficult to talk about a general explanatory framework for this phenomenon. In this regard, it is more accurate to talk about an inconclusive big farm or çiftlik debate, rather than a coherent, well-established literature. So, first of all, I'm planning to clarify the historiographical questions concerning these military farms, and I'm going to contextualize these privately owned estates within the conditions of the general social and economic transformation of the 17th century Ottoman Empire. Although the main bulk of the agrarian population remained as peasants, some members of the military class established privately owned farms by expropriating formerly state-owned peasant lands during the 17th century. These landowners enjoyed the military status without actually functioning as a military body, and they had a relatively large amount of lands in comparison with ordinary peasant holdings. With the primitive accumulation of its economic capital, the formation process of this new farm owner class began within the context of the social and political transformation of this century. In addition to their economic capital, members of this landowning group had also other economic, social, and political resources at their disposal to strategically use. Like any other social group, this newly emergent class was not just an outcome of the external causes, such as larger social, demographic, and economic forces. Rather, these farm owners came to establish a new class by acting consciously according to their material interests. They eventually formed a coherent social entity, which can be initially traced with farm ownership and later followed with the honorific title of ağa in Turkish in the archival sources. While this farm owner group was accumulating certain amount of wealth and local power by utilizing these resources, they also dispossessed some peasants who gradually became their tenants, sharecroppers, and workers. Furthermore, the land became the subject of exchange and inheritance more frequently in the 17th century. Thus, the classical rural social order changed and some new social groups emerged, such as landowners with military status, tenants, sharecroppers, agricultural workers, and even Janissary peasants. This last group, the Janissary peasants, is actually another novel case for this time, and it signifies another important transformation of the age, namely the expansion of the military class and its affiliations, which actually means the expansion of the political nation in Professor Baki Tezcan's terms. In the 17th century Kütahya and Salonika, some localized members of the military class emerged as the new landowners, and some people of Reaya origin entered into the ranks of the military class, and some others tried to find their way by being somehow associated with those military groups like these peasant janissaries or janissary peasants. In this regard, my research will also problematize the nature of general transformation of the Ottoman Empire by specifically focusing on the question of change in the class structure and the expansion of political society in a relational way. I'm planning to explain the making of such a complex social stratification process and to expand the scope of my research to other Anatolian and Balkan provinces, namely Hüdavendigar, Saruhan, Aydın, Sofia, and Silistra. I hope this study will contribute to scholarship on the 17th century social, political, and economic transformation of the Ottoman Empire. It will also theoretically and empirically broaden this historiographical framework without either falling into any Eurocentric teleological paths by assuming any sort of change came from external European influences or falling into any problematic readings of the decline of the empire, assuming the degeneration of the classical institutions. Moreover, this study can also historically explain the phenomenon of ağas in the Ottoman lands. The conventional wisdom dictates that landowner ağas were basically feudal lords, but my ongoing research says otherwise. It might be more accurate to define this social group as a landed gentry of the early modern period. Furthermore, this study can also explain the social and historical origins of local notables, otherwise known as ayans, the group that dominated the 18th century provinces of the Ottoman Empire and eventually challenged the imperial central authority in the late 18th century. Finally, this study may help us to reconsider the larger question of capitalist transformation in early modern Ottoman world by understanding this economic transformation with its own historical terms. I think that's all about me and my research. I'm looking forward to joining the academic community of ANAMED. Thank you and bye.